This is quite interesting because I would say that an actual fantasy army wouldn't, or humans at least, wouldn't fight particularly different than now. It depends on the magic system in the fantasy world and what beasts you can tame or are on your side. So let's see this one.
I think most people can agree that one of the coolest things about fantasy stories are the epic battles.
Hell yeah.
That's because not only do you get to see castles, trebuchets, soldiers hitting each other with swords, and heroes fighting one-on-one in single combat, stuff that's in most historical movies and TV, but you also get magic and dragons and scenarios constructed solely to be the coolest and most thematic thing that the author could think of.
Yeah.
There's this guy who
I mean, imagine just a freaking dragon comes out on your side and then just does the flame thing. Or can cast spells. Just a freaking gigantic snowball just falling on everyone. Freaking awesome war.
Shows up on YouTube channels talking about how accurate the battles in movies and TV were. His name is Roel Konijndijk. He's an expert on ancient warfare and a lecturer at Oxford University, but most people know him as the ditch guy.
Where is your ditch? Where is your ditch? You gotta have a ditch. Otherwise they're gonna run
Nice.
those siege towers right up to your
this,
wall.
Dave.
You know this. And obviously Jerusalem at the time did have a ditch, and it had a pre-wall and another ditch. So that you can't just put your siege engines right up to the wall.
Yes. By the way, ditches extremely effective. Even in those times. Extremely effective. It's just simply, even against arrows or something different, or just to hide, or just to lay down your equipment so it doesn't get shattered, or just go around, or just entrap or slow down the enemy. Everything's good. A ditch is something beautiful. A ditch is something that we need in situations like this. So yes, ditch is life.
That's because he criticizes most armies and media for forgoing the most basic step in defensive warfare for most of human history, the humble ditch. It really makes sense. If your goal is to stop your opponent from getting to or past you, your first line of defense shouldn't be your shield wall, it should be getting past a big fuck-off ditch first. It slows the enemy down so they can't charge into you with their main force or with their cavalry. It also creates a kill zone for your ranged troops as the enemy works to fill it in or otherwise bypass it. And all that together is just a huge blow to the enemy momentum and morale, which could be the most important reason to have one in the first place.
Hell yeah.
So if the ditch is that important to period armies, why are they so often forgone in their cinema and TV adaptations? Simply put, the very fact that it breaks up a charge and slows an enemy down also means that it slows down the action.
Exactly. This is basically all this is about, because it slows down the action. And the thing is, even real life fights, they don't take this long as you see in movies. It's a quick thing. It's not even close to the action movies. I mean, at some point, you just lose all your stamina. Equipment is heavy. Even the equipment that we wear these days for fighting, you will feel it after a while.
Yes, not allowing your enemy to charge into your lines is tactically sound, but is it worth it if it means you don't get to see two battle lines charging into each other on an open field? This has been talked about to death, but I needed an excuse to yap about it myself, so I'm gonna bring up maybe the worst battle tactic I've ever seen put to screen. I'm talking, of course, about the elves' suicide charge in the Battle of Five Armies.
I feel you, brother. This was one of the stupidest, most inefficient, most bollocks moment in the entire cinematics of Herr der Ringe, Lord of the Ring. But what did it look freaking epic? It did. It's stupid, but F me, this is one of the coolest looking scenes in the entire movie. And it's still tactically stupid.
Armies movie. Here you can see the dwarven heavy phalanx wheel to face the enemy, who is charging into them. This is the ideal scenario for the dwarves, the exact kind of situation that their infantry is built to deal with.
Yes.
A direct charge of enemy infantry into their spear wall. It's this exact formation that Alexander the Great used to conquer most of the known world.
It's correct.
The issue with the phalanx formation is that it lacks mobility and has a weakness to heavy-ranged warfare and artillery. But the orcs were just charging into them. It was the perfect scenario to set up the good guys for a win. So of course the elves ruin it. Instead of doing, I don't know, anything else, they jump over the shield wall into the oncoming orc horde in a suicide maneuver. This forces the dwarves to break up their perfect defensive formation, because the momentum of the enemy would inevitably push the elves back into their own allies' spears. So in order to not let their allies die, they have to charge in, essentially throwing away their advantage. Now this could be thematic if you chalk this up to elven pride and not wanting the dwarves to be the heroes of the story. But since there is no talk about this after the battle's over, I'd see this as the filmmakers deciding that a cool shot was worth more than anything that made sense.
Exactly. It's and by the way, already very good. Yes, I agree with him, and it just looks epic. It looks really epic, but you would never do it. You would never do such a thing in real life. It is honestly just so freaking. Oh, I already said my mind about it. It's just and I think a dwarf would maybe ram a spear into a elf's back. Just I may or may not be a bit, well, let's just say, negatively attuned against elves. For some reason. I cannot tell the reason why. I cannot tell how. But maybe there is a thing.
In the moment. Let me quickly show you how to make better use of the elves in this battle. Leave the dwarves where they are to meet the oncoming horde. They're incredibly heavy infantry, so they're going to hold out a really long time. Let the elves stand behind them and shoot arrows at the enemy to make good use of what the elves are actually good at. Now, if you have these elite elven shock infantry to use, you should use them like how you would use a cavalry unit. Either have them protect the dwarven flanks, or charge the enemy's flanks if you have the opportunity. The elves in Lord of the Rings are notoriously very fast, so they could even act as a light cavalry unit and try to get to the enemy archers or the enemy rear. Really, almost any use of them would be better than what they did in the film. It reminds me of the suicide charge of the Dothraki into the massed infantry formation of undead, but that's really been talked to death, so I'll leave that there. Now, they could have also gone with an encirclement tactic, sort of the weak center Hannibal thing, but I feel like because they didn't have a unified leadership, that wouldn't have worked well enough. I think poor battle tactics representation in fantasy stories bothers me even more than in historical stories, since in historical stories, the author didn't invent the setting. In fantasy, the author literally created everything whole cloth, so there really is no excuse for poor battle tactics in service of cinematic narrative moments.
I would say that in a historical sense, no, there isn't any excuse except it looks cool. In fantasy, though, I would say there could be one specific excuse that maybe could work and make sense. Namely, if you have a wizard or a magician that actually buffs your people or just guides them with, let's just say, flame wars or something like that, walls, or gives them shields or something like that, and the people just forget those tactics because they are just simply unnecessary, because you have a wizard that actually can make everything work, then you could have an excuse after losing that wizard why their tactics are poor. Why are they doing this bollocks thing instead of actually doing it correctly? Then maybe.
Beyond pure laziness. So how should you depict battles in a fantasy world? If you have a complex magic system, it can be difficult. But that's why you should be thinking about this when you are creating your world and your magic system.
I love this.
You should start your world building with your cool ideas, but then bring it back immediately to the most basic questions, like, what do they eat? If this race has this natural power and longevity, why aren't they ruling the world? If this spell existed, what would people actually use it for day to day? If you don't answer questions like this when you're developing your world, you're setting yourself up for Hogwarts-sized plot holes. Now, sometimes plot holes don't really matter if your story isn't about that. For instance, if you're writing fantasy Regency romance and it doesn't concern itself with geopolitics, people could forgive you for adding a spell to it that would have allowed a fantasy Napoleon to easily just take over the world. Or would they forgive that? It depends. For me, it comes down heavily to verisimilitude. Does your world offer enough possible answers to the questions your world building brings up? Because if that spell existed that allowed Napoleon to take over, but other spells exist that could have potentially countered it, you don't have to specifically answer that in your story. Your world building is doing it for you. People will just argue about it on Reddit and grant your story more longevity. But if there's literally no reason why something wouldn't have happened, given your world building besides that wasn't what your story is about, you're gonna have problems.
A few years ago, this is actually quite interesting because I read a book. I just don't know, it was in the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon took over or won a lot of wars because of his artillery, and it basically had fantasy elements to it with basics, not high fantasy but low fantasy, but they had dragons. So dragons and the other countries had artilleries, but they could counter Napoleon's artilleries with dragons. So that's why he didn't instantly take everything over and blah, blah, blah. So there was an literal, like a counter to it. To a certain
You can
degree.
justify anything in your world with enough work, but it's a balancing act of making sure that your fix doesn't break something somewhere else.
Yes.
That's why it's better to be on top of these things and thinking about it at the very top of your world building. So if you were to translate these concepts of verisimilitude to a world where the powers people have in Dungeons & Dragons exist, how would an army even fight? When a spell like Fireball exists, would units still fight in tight clusters? If there are Griffin Riders from Waterdeep, would that give them an uncounterable advantage against other city-states should they come to blows? How could anyone deal with higher-level wizards that can cast things like Meteor Storm a mile away? The questions in the D&D
Or the
world
wish spell.
are endless, but luckily they don't suffer the world-building problem I mentioned earlier because the potential answers are also endless. You could raise a dozen scenarios that seem unbeatable, but then come up with 100.
Yeah, I mean, unbeatable is something like a Lich that actually also is a necromancer and just, well, says, stand up, zombie, and just fight for me again. Let's do it. Go, go, go. Just saying, maybe, an idea.
Ways to beat them. I'm currently running a D&D campaign set in a fantasy world inspired by Caesar's invasion of Gaul, and in the process of world building, the question raised itself to me too. How would a legion fight in a world with magic and monsters? Let's break down the challenges that the Legion would likely face in this area of the world and go over how the Legion would structure itself to combat those. First, magic. It's definitely a big problem. It's unpredictable and could be used to quickly break battle lines and morale, things the Legion needs to maintain, especially when they're fighting enemies who number much greater than them. A Legion is about 5,500 soldiers, subdivided into 10 cohorts of around 480 soldiers, subdivided again into centuries of about 80 soldiers. Each century would have a standard bearer, which in history was meant to provide everything from cohesion to morale. But in this world, it has one more function. It provides an anti-magic shield that extends over the century in
Yeah,
combat.
that could be one
Now, these
solution.
standards were magic items created by a cult of mysteries deep within the Republic and distributed to the legions as eagles to top their standards. Beyond being a symbol of their honor, this eagle now means so much more to the soldiers of the Legion. It's their lifeblood. Without the eagle, enemy magicians can now work freely on them. The thing about magic in D&D is at lower levels, which most in-world spellcasters are, magic is a pretty short-range tool. Fireball has a range of about 150 feet. A longbow has a range of around 600 feet in-game, and in real life it could be closer to 1,000 feet. Now granted, Roman legions weren't the biggest utilizers of the bow and arrow, preferring slings and javelins, but their auxiliary forces used them a lot, as did their Gallic enemies in this period. What the Romans did have was artillery in the form of catapults and ballista, weapons with the effective firepower of a wizard's fireball, but with much greater range and the ability to be mass-produced. With those two elements combined, anti-magic standards and artillery support, the legions are able to counter two great advantages their enemies have. However, that's not the only trick up their enemies' sleeves. The other major component of ancient warfare was cavalry superiority, and in a world with flying mounts and bird races, we also need to consider air superiority. As we
Yep.
mentioned, the legions typically don't use large numbers of archers outside of auxiliary forces, which means that their enemies could use Aarakocra forces to constantly harass the legions from the air. The legion could deal with this in a few ways. 1. When fighting an enemy with Aarakocra, they can employ a greater number of archer auxiliaries. 2. We could introduce an elite griffin riding unit to the legion, but I'd imagine their numbers would be small and they'd need to be used very strategically on the battlefield. A commander would likely be loath to risk them in small skirmish operations. So 3. The legions could employ their own Aarakocra auxiliaries. This combined with
Yeah, the thing is, except for the airfolk, just other birds to kill the other birds, everything else is irrelevant. Because you can fly higher than a bow can shoot. Simple as that. And you can drop a stone from a way higher advantage point than a bow can shoot you. So, just other flyers, that's the only thing. Everything else,
the
irrelevant.
additional archer auxiliaries would be most likely the direction that the Legion would take, because it's essentially what they did historically when dealing with enemies that had cavalry superiority. They just hired cavalry to do the job for them. Of course, there are really interesting dynamics at play when you rely heavily on auxiliaries to counter your enemies. If the auxiliaries are coming from cultures similar to your enemies, and it becomes more obvious that your goals are less protect the borders of the Republic and more take over a huge swath of new territory, the source of those auxiliaries might dry up and join the enemy, putting the Legion in a situation where they may need to import new auxiliary forces from further corners of the Republic, which means more cost and more time to replenish forces. One advantage that the enemies of the Legion in this region have that would be difficult to overcome are the Druids. The ability to weaponize the land, both flora and fauna, would be an impressive tool, especially in guerrilla warfare. They could quickly grow food to feed an army, communicate between forces using animal messengers, and create difficult terrain to guard retreats. They could summon animals to harry Legion outriders. This is the main strength of a fantasy.
Yet, the fantasy, everything's possible. You could, but what if an archer has like a spell that makes their arrows travel faster and longer, or enhance their bows? Flying isn't so relatable. The thing is, as soon as you get in magic spells, everything's possible. If you don't have certain rules, everything could be. It could also be that the flying creatures just have an anti-magic thing that disturbs the arrows and shoots them back at the shooters. There is a lot of what ifs. I am staying in the realm of if you don't have magic that can just do instantly everything you have, because, well, you could also just have a magician, a death magician, that just says, okay, you're dead. And that's all. Or I think in Aragon was a pretty nice thing where you could actually, with a spell, just, how's it called, cut off the string between your head and your body, the nerves, like in the backbone, in the neck bone. And, well, the enemy's just done. It's an end. It has an end to it. It's just done. So yeah, there is magic makes everything complicated if it doesn't have any rules to it.
Fantasy Gallic analog, and it's a strategy I could see Vercingetorix using since he was famous for his guerrilla-style war against Caesar. I could go on forever spitballing about scenarios that could come up due to the fantasy setting and then come up with ways that the Legion would deal with them in-universe, using the strategies and philosophies they used historically. That could be my whole Saturday night, and often has been. The key takeaway that I hope you get from this is to be excited to ask and answer these sorts of questions, either for your own fantasy story or your D&D game. I'd try to get you not to do the Hollywood thing of hand-waving away the most interesting parts of your world just to get that one cinematic moment. I think you'll find you'll get much more buy-in from both your readers and your players if you respect the world you've built, because then it feels worth it to invest their time and energy into it as well. Thanks so much for watching.
Yeah, the thing also is, it's just... you need to follow some rules with the entire thing. That's all. If you have rules there, then it's fine. Those AI produced things, adventurer tier, a lizard. Okay, fair enough. Damn.